Okay, so we're going to record. So what we'll talk about this week is going to do a really big picture version of American history, and then we'll start talking about the government. So then we'll talk about the government, the three branches of government this week, next week, and then we'll just progress through there. So, like I said, this is probably 4 weeks. If we slow down, maybe 5 weeks, and we'll just talk our way through it. I want to hear what you guys know, and and if there's any gaps in your knowledge, then we can fill that in. And we'll go from there, touching on a lot of big, important social studies topics, one by one. Okay. So what is this? What city is this a picture of on the screen here?
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. Yeah. So what's this tall dome building in the middle?
The White House.
No, it's not the White
Capitol.
House.
Capitol.
Yeah, it's the Capitol building. Okay, the U.S. Capitol building. That is the what we say is the seat of our national government. The White House on this is called this grassy area here, and this kind of the whole area is called the National Mall. Now, it's not a mall where you shop, but it's kind of an old use of the word mall, kind of just an open space. From the Capitol building to this spike, this is the Washington Monument, is about a mile. And then it's another most of a mile from this Washington Monument down, and then you can't really see it, but the Lincoln Memorial. So the National Mall in Washington, D.C., you can go there. A couple of years ago, my family and I, we had a couple of kids, and we said, it's there. So let's go to Washington. You can, you just park on the street and you can walk around. A little bit more security now than there was before, but it's there for American citizens to enjoy. And these are all on the sides. These are all big, famous, and free museums like the Smithsonian museums, art museums, history museums, National Air and Space Museum. Big museums that are free. So it's pretty awesome. The White House here see this grassy space or this tree. It's the White House is, you can't see it, I don't think, but it's in this area up here. It's kind of off the National Mall. But this building, the Dome building, is the Capitol building. It is the home of the legislative branch. I believe this other little dome right in front, on the front left, it kind of facing away from the camera here, is the Supreme Court building. Okay, the judicial branch of government we're going to talk about. And then the White House and connected offices is the home of the president and the many people that make up the executive branch. So those are the three branches of government, right? The legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch. So we're going to talk about them. We'll probably get to that today. So I like Washington, D.C. It's a pretty city. We'll talk about it a little bit. Okay. So first, let's jump into a timeline. Now, this is one of the things that if your goal is to take the GED test or the HiSET test for social studies or even science, there are visual things on the test, right? They're going to be a little bit different for social studies than for science, but there's visual things. A timeline is something you have to be prepared for, okay? So a timeline here, you always have a line, that's what makes it a timeline, and you have chronological order. We see on the left-hand side 1607, that's the year 1607. And here, this timeline doesn't go up to today. The last thing we have is 1791. Okay, so that's the time span that this timeline is covering. So this is the America, and the title, okay, whenever you see on a test, whenever you see a visual thing like this, a map or something, first thing you look at is the title. And so the title here is American Colonies, right? So America the country of America that we live in today, before it was a country, who did it belong to? Think back in history. Well, let me ask you this. Who first lived in this land that we call
Native Americans.
Maybe Native American.
Yeah, Native Americans. So Native Americans have lived, some people call them Indians or Indian Americans, Native Americans. Native means, if you are a native of Pennsylvania, it means you are a person from Pennsylvania. Native Americans is the term that just means people who originally were here. Native Americans, humans, have lived in North and South America, North America, where we are now, for 30, scientists think 30,000 years. They lived here for a very long time without even knowing about other people, right? The people living in Africa or Asia or Europe, right? Because the world hadn't been connected yet by people traveling in ships. So for tens of thousands of years, Native Americans lived here and had big civilizations. Not as popular, certainly not as populated as today, but they had cities. There was a city in what's now the area of St. Louis, Missouri. There was a city of 100,000 people. Like Native Americans had cities. They were different than our cities today, but they had big civilizations. Okay. Then you have Columbus, right? And this is not on this timeline, but we're just kind of jumping backwards. Columbus discovered, we say, came in and conquered, really. Him and other people from Portugal and Spain and Italy discovered for themselves and explored and kind of conquered North America and South America, right? We get then to 1607. So now let's jump onto this timeline. 1607, about 100 years after Columbus arrived in North America. And we have Jamestown, Virginia, founded by British colonists. So they came, this is British people from England, from Britain, exploring and coming to this land that they knew of. Now they knew it was here for 100 years. They knew it was over here. But they're like, we're going to go live there. So they got on some ships and they arrived in what is now Jamestown, Virginia. And they said, we're going to set up a town. This is going to be where we live. And they called it Jamestown, Virginia, 1607. Okay. 1620, Plymouth, Massachusetts, founded by British coming on the Mayflower. So have you heard, who's heard of the Pilgrims and the Mayflower? Has anybody never heard of the Pilgrims and their ship called the Mayflower? Okay, so we've heard of that before. What do you think of, what is associated with, what do we think of when we think of the Pilgrims? What in American culture do we put with the Pilgrims?
British culture.
They were British, okay. I'm thinking November is coming. At the end of November, what holiday is in November that we celebrate?
Thanksgiving.
Yeah, so Thanksgiving is kind of, it goes back in history, and it's a celebration of kind of the Pilgrims coming and having a successful start and starting up this colony in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Okay, so 1607, 1620, two different groups of British people came and set up colonies. They set up a village. They said, this is where we're going to live now. They said, this land now belongs to Britain. It is a British colony. Of course, the Native Americans that already lived there were kind of confused by that. There were some wars, there was some fighting. And then they kind of got to a point, for a long time, they got to a point where the British people who had just showed up and started living, and the Native Americans, they got along, they cooperated, they lived side by side. There was some conflict, but overall they learned to coexist because they had to coexist. So 1607 to 1732, the original 13 colonies form as British colonies in America. So the original 13 colonies are listed here underneath and the year of their founding. So Virginia was first, the Jamestown, Virginia, they come, they set up, and they say, okay, this land is Virginia. And then Massachusetts, the Pilgrims come in 1620. And then they expand. More people come, more people come. British, but also French and Spanish. A lot of British and French, really. And they're setting up these colonies. Okay, Pennsylvania was kind of late to the party in 1681. Was almost the last of the 13 colonies to be founded. Now, people lived here. European people lived here for a long time before that, but then they didn't make it a colony until 1681. Okay. Now, has anybody heard of the French and Indian War? It's not one of the biggest wars. Has anybody heard of it? French and Indian War? Okay. It happens in the 1750s, 1760s. Okay. And I have the French and Indian War. The British beat the French and Indians for control of Eastern North American colonies. Really, this parts of Pennsylvania and things. It was a war for several years between the British on one side and the French and Indians who were working together on the other side. Because the British and the French wanted to control this new land of North America and these colonies. Now, they were all British colonies, but France is like, hey, we'd like that to be French land. So they fought a war. The British won the French and Indian War. And so they become really strong British colonies. Okay, so they remain British colonies. The French tried to take over, but then they lost that war. Then we get into the period of the middle and late 1700s, when these British colonists were becoming upset. Okay, things change. People's attitudes change. So, what are some of the things that does anybody know? Just come up with any ideas, things you've heard about. What are some of the things that lead the British colonies to become their own country? What are some things we associate with that change? They go from British people, they're British, living in British colonies, and then by 1776, they become Americans, right? And now we're here as Americans. What are some of the things that get to that point?
Good evening. I'm late. Sorry.
Ruby, yeah, no problem. Thank you for
Yeah, I just
logging
came
in.
home.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, welcome, Ruby. We're just working through this early American history timeline.
Right.
So, what are some of the things? Does anybody know anything about the battles, the war, the change that take the British colonies from colonists to becoming Americans, to the United States of America?
They want freedom.
Yeah, they won freedom. Okay.
Yes. From the government.
From which government? Who?
British.
Right. Okay. So they are British, right? They're British people. If you're
Yes.
living in Pennsylvania in the 1750s, 1760s, you are British. But they've been British colonies by that point for 150 years, right? So, you know, your father, your grandfather, his father have all been British,
Uh-huh.
but they're living across an ocean from Britain, right? And
Yes.
so over 150 years, things start to change, and the people living in these 13 colonies
Mm-hmm.
start to view themselves as a little bit different than the British people living over in London, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they say, you know, we're different. We're living here. Maybe we should think of ourselves not quite as British. And then the British government starts to treat them, they thought, a little bit unfairly. They
Mm-hmm.
raised taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they taxed. Has anybody heard of the Boston Tea Party?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Julietta, have you ever heard of the Boston Tea Party?
And no, never.
Okay. Well, the Boston Tea Party, it wasn't a party. Um, it was a moment where the British government in London was put a high tax, a very expensive tax on tea. Now, people drank a lot of tea back then.
Right.
They drank tea. Everybody drank tea. Rich people, poor people, everybody drank tea.
Mm-hmm.
And the government, in order to raise money for the government, put a
Mm-hmm.
tax on tea. So then the people in Boston, up in Boston, Massachusetts, they didn't like that, right? They didn't want their tea to be more expensive
Mm-hmm.
to pay for the government. That their problem was there wasn't any representatives in the government in London representing the colonies over here. So
Mm-hmm.
they said, why should we pay for the government if we don't have a say in anything? We don't have any representatives over in the government in London. So they broke onto a ship, you know, a big sailing ship full of tea, and they dumped it into the river.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, you know, ruining the tea, right? So that was called, then they called it kind of as a joke, they called it the
Mm-hmm.
Boston Tea Party. It
Right.
was a protest. So it says 1773,
Mm-hmm.
Boston Tea Party to protest British tea tax.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we're going to get into like the real changes start to happen. And that's just one of many things. The Boston Tea Party is just one of many times where the British government was taxing and making laws that the American colonists didn't agree with. They felt was unfair. Um, a lot of taxes. They thought things were expensive. They taxed sugar. They taxed
Mm-hmm.
paper. All kinds of stuff. So it gets to the point where the American colonists, people living here, they're still British, but they say, you know what, we're not really British. We don't like it, and we don't have to be. We don't want to be British anymore. So 1776, they had the Continental Congress, which was like an unofficial meeting, and it was really illegal according to the British government. But
Okay.
every state sent representatives to Philadelphia. Okay, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at the time, it's a big city. I think the biggest city in the colonies. So every state sent a handful of people, all men. They sent a handful of men to Philadelphia to have a big meeting. They called it the Continental Congress. And they met for weeks in the spring and summer of 1776. And the job was think about, hey, what are we going to do about this? The British government rules us unfairly. They're taxing us unfairly. We don't like it. What can we do? So by July 4th, 1776, they sign the Declaration of Independence. Okay. That's why on July 4th every summer we have Independence Day. So let me ask you this. What does the Declaration, they wrote out the Declaration of Independence, and then all the men there signed it. What does the Declaration of Independence say? What did it do? Oluwakemi, do you know?
Independence.
Hello?
Yeah, Oluwakemi, what do you think?
Yeah, you said Declaration of Independence.
Mhm. Yeah, what did it say? What did it do?
The Declaration of was when
They signed a
British-
paper. Everybody signed papers. The government people all signed papers, right?
Yeah, they signed it. It was
Mhm.
a
Yeah.
thing they
Mhm.
wrote out and they signed it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean, the Declaration of Independence? Oluwakemi, what do you think?
that was when the independence was signed and the slavery came to an end. Oh no, that's the emancipation of the. That was when independence was signed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they declare, it's a declaration. They declare, they say,
Yeah, okay. Mhm.
uh, they declare, they tell the world that they are independent of Britain, right?
Okay. Mhm.
And so that's the moment, and sometimes we call July 4th America's birthday, right? Because that's the time by signing that paper. I don't know how many men signed it, maybe like, I think maybe around 50. They represented all the 13 colonies. It was their agreement that they said, we don't want to be British anymore. We want these 13 colonies to be a new country. We are declaring our independence from Britain,
Mhm.
right? So, and I always think of it like this. So in my family, we have 3 kids. And so they're now, 2 of them are teenagers and they're getting a little bit old and they're well behaved. But like every teenager, there's times where teenagers, they want their independence, right? They're trying to be their own people. They're growing up, things are changing.
Mhm.
Think of it like if you had an argument, if you're a parent and you had an argument with your teenage child, right? Maybe 17 years old, 18 years old, maybe a high school graduate, okay? Not a little kid, but an older kid. And you have an argument about something. Really, America, the colonies in Britain were having an argument about something, how they were going to be governed. And sometimes when parents and teenagers fight, the teenager says, I'm going to run away, right? I don't want to be part of this family anymore. Sometimes people say mean, hurtful things, but like the kid says, I don't want to be part of this family anymore. I'm going to move out and get a job and I'm just going to do my own thing, right?
Mhm.
That's the child declaring independence of the family. Well, any good parent is going to say, no, you're not leaving this family. That's not safe. You're not going to do that. And that's what Britain did. Britain said, no, we don't agree to that. We're not going to let our colonies go and become a new country. So they fought a war. So now we have the next thing on our timeline, 1775 to 1783, Revolutionary War between Great Britain and American colonies.
Right.
The revolution is the American colonies revolting against Britain, right? Trying to break away from Britain. So we call it the Revolutionary War, or this whole time period we call the American Revolution. It's the colonies trying to break away from Britain and become their own country. Now, the war goes on for what, 8 years, 7, 8 years, 1783. In the middle of the war, the Americans, let's call them Americans now, they've declared independence, right? So the leaders have said, we are our own country. We're going to call it the United States of America. It's a new country.
Mhm.
They've invented a new country. They said, we're not British anymore. So a country needs a government. So in the middle of the war, they're like, well, we got to start living our life, right? So 1777, the Continental Congress, all these representatives from all the different colonies now, states,
Mhm.
they adopt what they called the Articles of Confederation. This isn't something that we think about in history very much. Okay, the Articles of Confederation was the first type of government of the United States. Okay, it is not the government that the type of government we have today. The Articles of Confederation was slightly different. It was similar. There was a president, but the president didn't have as many powers. There was a legislative body, there was Congress, but it didn't quite do all the same things that it does today. The Articles of Confederation was the first government, their first try at having a United States government. The problem was, and this isn't super important, the problem was that it gave a lot of power to the states. Every state, it was almost like every state was its own country. And then the federal government, the national government, was just kind of very loose, very weak to try to keep everybody cooperating. So the states, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, South Carolina, all operated almost like their own little country. And the national government just kind of was very loose. Okay. They found that wasn't really working. So they win the war, 1783, the war ends. They beat Britain. The British, the British army leaves, they lose. This is now the United States of America officially. And then around 1787, they're like, you know what, this Articles of Confederation government, it's not, we can do better. We got to try something different. So then they wrote the US Constitution. And that's what we have today. Everybody talks about the Constitution. That's their second try at a new government. It's okay, let's change a few things. Let's make it 3 branches of government. That's what we're going to talk about later on. Okay, so there's 3 documents around this American Revolution time that you really got to know. The Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, not super important, but it is important to know, like, that was the first try at a government. They did it, and then they were like, well, we can do a little bit better. And then the US Constitution. People are always confusing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Okay, so it's really important to know. The Declaration of Independence was really just a short document that said, we are a new nation. We are not part of Britain anymore. They declared their independence from Britain.
Okay.
It didn't set up a government. All it did was say, we are breaking away from Britain. The US Constitution is what creates a government. Now, it was the second try of a government, but the US Constitution is their description of a government, like kind of the game plan for going forward. Okay, so they wrote it. Representatives from every state, all 13 now states, agreed upon it, and there was arguments. And there's really interesting books, all kinds of things written about how they wrote the Constitution, how they agreed upon all the different parts of it. Not every state loved every part of it, but they came to an agreement. And then over a period of 3 years, every state, it says here, 1787 to 1790, all 13 states ratify, agree to, approve of the US Constitution. Okay. Because they said, okay, we got this document. This is going to be our new government. But of course, everybody has to agree to it, right? So every state government then needed to approve of the Constitution. 1791, the Bill of Rights is adopted. And we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights. It comes very shortly after the US Constitution is passed. What it was, and we'll talk about it in depth later, it was the first 10 amendments. They were already changing. To amend means to change. It was the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Okay. So I got some pictures here. this is, you know, the list of the colonies. This is a stamp of the Pilgrims and the Mayflower. This is the list of colonies. This is the map of those colonies. They're all on the East Coast, right? Pennsylvania. This is where the British landed and set up 13 different colonies. This is a famous piece of art that shows the Boston Massacre, which was one of the times when, you know, back in the American Revolution, the colonists were protesting the British, and the British shot them. It happened in Boston, Massachusetts, and killed some colonists that were protesting. And so, like, that was one of the things that pushed the colonists to want to be free, to be independent. And then this is a painting. This is kind of, I like the painting of the American army fighting the British in the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War. This British guy we would call a redcoat. The redcoats were the nickname for the British soldiers because that's how they dressed. They were wearing red coats. It was just their different style back then. Okay, so let's look at a couple of these documents. Again, like I said, the Declaration of Independence, you got to know the difference between that and the Constitution. So let's look at those right now. Okay, and this is a painting. The Declaration of Independence was written kind of these, it was the whole maybe 50 or so men gathered in Philadelphia to talk, to discuss, to come up with some plan. And then three of them, Ben Franklin, who is seated here with the glasses, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, kind of were the ones who put their heads together and wrote the Declaration of Independence. Julietta, could you read? Do you mind reading this paragraph for us?
The complete page?
Yeah. Can you
Or,
see that? Okay?
yeah, okay. The Declaration of Independence, sing July 4th, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, that wherever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government.
Yeah, okay. Elena, I see you have a doctor's appointment.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Yep. Have a good
Bye.
day. Thanks. Okay, thank you, Julietta. So this is what they wrote. This is the beginning. It's longer. It's the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Now let's go through here and look at things. Where am I? Okay. Sorry about that. So let's go through here and see what this really says. Okay. This is the introduction to, excuse me. It's basically an essay. It's longer than this, but this is kind of the introduction paragraph. So this is them declaring to the whole world. They knew that people in other countries, certainly the people in Britain, were going to read this. And so this is them explaining why they were breaking away from it, why they wanted to. So they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay, self-evident means obvious to everybody. Everybody should understand this. So that all men, so it's kind of a list then. We hold these things to be self-evident. We feel that these are all true things that everybody should recognize. And then it's really a list. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed, given by their creator, God, with certain unalienable rights. So people have God-given rights. Everybody has rights. And then among these, the rights are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everybody has those rights. That to secure these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, of the governed. So what that means is, when people make a government, the purpose of a government, no matter what country you're in, the purpose of having a government is to protect the rights of the people. Okay, the same. That's the reason people long ago invented having a government, having a leader, whoever it might be. Okay, then it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, of these things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new governments. So they're saying, what they're saying is, they're telling the world, the purpose of a government is to protect your rights. When your government is not protecting your rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you should get a new government. You should overthrow, alter, change, or abolish it, end it, right? The rest of the Declaration of Independence, it's actually, it's not super long, but it's a long list of, like literally just a list of the problems they had with the king. I think it was King George at the time. Like they literally just list all the things he's done wrong, all the things that all the way he's harmed the American colonies, the high taxes, the unfair laws. So it's their point. The point they're making is the purpose of government is to make our lives better and safer and more protected. And the British government's not doing that. So we are getting we don't want to be with the British government anymore. Okay. So whenever you see, and this is certainly the most famous part, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. This is the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Declaration of Independence does not set up our government. All it does is declare the independence of the colonies. They don't want to be with the British anymore. Okay. Okay. Any questions on the Declaration of Independence?
Any what?
Any questions?
Oh, any question.
Okay. Well, let's turn then to the U.S. Constitution. This here is a famous thing. You've probably heard "We the People" before. This is the preamble. Again, the introduction to the U.S. Constitution. Now, this is 10 years after the Declaration of Independence. They tried the first government, the Articles of Confederation government, and they said, you know what, this isn't quite right. We can do better. Let's redesign a new government. So America was already up and running, but they're like, you know what, this isn't going to work. Let's redo this. Let's come up with a new government. So then they met, leaders from every state. They met again, I believe in Philadelphia again, and they said, okay, now this is the new government. This is what we're going to do. This here on the screen is the very famous preamble, the introduction. Okay. People back then, they gave a lot of speeches, they wrote a lot of letters, they were very purposeful in how they communicated. So they weren't just going to say, we want a new government and this is how it's going to be. Like they wrote very beautifully about these very important ideas, right? Ruby, could you read this paragraph for us?
Okay, thank you. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more practiced union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to over ourselves and our posterity
Posterity.
to do ordain
Ordain.
ordain and establish this constitution for the United States of America.
Okay. So they did, this was 250 years ago. They used some words that we don't really use anymore sometimes. But
Mhm,
overall, when you go to take the test or you're studying history,
mhm,
most old documents like this, if you take a moment and you read it carefully, you can figure out what it says. The problem is a lot of the way they wrote at the time, they used very long sentences, very
mhm.
complex, complicated sentences.
Right.
But generally, if you take your time, you can figure out what they're saying. So I've changed the color here, and there's really
Okay.
3 parts to this sentence.
Okay.
Okay. The beginning says, "We the people of the United States." Okay, just we the people. The government gets its power from the people, right? People agree to have a government, and when they don't want that government anymore, they're going to overthrow that government, like they did in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. So they say, "We the people of the United States, in order to," and then they list a bunch of things in green.
Uh-huh.
Okay, we'll talk about those. "In order to do all these things,
Okay.
we do ordain and establish, we declare, we ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States." So the green, these things that are mainly listed here, are the reasons, the goals they have for their government. Right? They're making a new government.
Mhm,
Here are the things they want it to do. It says to form a more perfect union, the union among the states.
mhm,
Okay. Establish justice, right? We know what justice is.
mhm,
Fairness. Ensure domestic tranquility, domestic meaning at home, and tranquility meaning peace. So domestic tranquility is peace within the United States. Sorry, my dog is scratching at his head. He'll scratch for like 3 minutes and then there he goes again. Chip. There he goes. I don't know where to work. He scratches at his bed for like a long time before he lays down. Okay. So the list of the things they want the government to do: ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, right? Defend us from other countries. That's part of the government's job. Promote the general welfare, making sure people are well, safe, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Anybody know what posterity is?
No.
Long time?
Well, yeah, for a long time. It's kind of that idea.
Mhm.
Well, post is a prefix that usually means after, right?
Uh-huh.
If I say something is post World War II, that means it happens after World War II, right?
Oh.
Like pre and post. Okay. So our posterity are people who will come after us, our children, our grandchildren. So to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, people coming later. Those are the jobs, the goals that they have for the government. Okay. The
Oh.
rest of the Constitution, which isn't terribly long, you can read it, describes the government. But this preamble, this introduction paragraph, is their description of what they want the government to do. Okay. Why do we have a government? This is why we have a government, to do these things right here. Okay. The other thing, they're living at a time in the 1780s, 1770s, 1780s, where things are changing, right? And just 10 years ago before this, they started a new country because they didn't like their old one. So like things are changing big time. You know, and so they're saying they're taking a second and they're saying, why do we have a government? What do we want our government to accomplish? What's the purpose here of us all agreeing to be part of this nation? And they're saying, this is what we want, right? To form a more perfect union. We want justice, we want tranquility, we want to be protected. So this is them really thinking it out, really being purposeful. Okay, so this is very famous. We the People. When you read We the People, that's, you know, generally people are talking about the preamble of the Constitution. Okay, last, let's get through the Bill of Rights, or start talking a little bit about the Bill of Rights. We'll end at 12 o'clock here. Okay, the Bill of Rights, it says, are the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. When they wrote the Constitution, part of the Constitution is it says itself how it can be changed. There's a process where Congress or the country can change, alter, or add to the Constitution to make amendments, right? Fixes. So these are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They were signed and ratified or passed by the states immediately after the Constitution took effect. They focus heavily on the rights of individuals and especially the rights of people accused of crimes in the new nation. Okay. Now, this is word for word the first, second, and third amendment. So the Bill of Rights, the constitutional amendments, they're not big, they're not long. You can read them in a couple of sentences, a couple of seconds.
Mhm.
But these are changes that they made or things that they added to the Constitution because they thought it was very important. These are things that were not in the Constitution as it was originally written, but they said, you know what, we gotta get this in there, and so it was passed through the process of passing an amendment. So the First Amendment, maybe you've heard of First Amendment rights. This is it. Okay, this is the whole thing. This is all there is to it. It's very simple, but of course it's also very complicated. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting or just about an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So Congress cannot tell you what church to go to church, not go to church. Congress, the government isn't involved in religion, right? Or shall make no law or abridging the freedom of speech or the freedom of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, to protest something, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances if you have a complaint against the government. Okay, the big ones here: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Those are the ones you hear about. Freedom of speech is the most complicated. And people write millions of books about explaining what these things mean, but they're very short. There's only a couple of words describing them here. And yet, people spend their whole lives studying what does freedom of speech mean, because it can become very complicated. Amendment 2, very short. A well-regulated militia or army, right, fighting force, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So when somebody talks about their Second Amendment rights, sometimes you hear about the Second Amendment in the news or people talking about it. What does that mean?
That means you have right to have weapons.
Yeah, okay, so a gun, right? Everybody's always talking about Second Amendment rights. I have a right to bear arms, to carry a gun.
To bear arms.
Yeah, the right to bear arms. And we don't talk really about bearing arms today.
No.
But that's a phrase that they used back then. But yeah, to have a weapon. we have
Mhm.
a right, and unless, there's a couple of reasons why you would not be allowed to have a gun.
Right.
If you don't have a crime on your record, then you can
Mhm.
own a gun.
Mhm.
Now, some people say that the idea here, think historically, back in the 1700s, there was no army like we have today. What we
Uh-huh.
have today is called a standing army. People are in the army. You sign up and you're in it for 4 years. You can sign up for another 4 years. That army is always ready. They're trained. Everything's ready. If a war broke out today, they could be fighting today, right?
Mm.
We have a standing army. Back then, they did not have a standing army.
Mhm.
If a war broke out, they would put out a call, and it would be all men, but young men would all come. They'd take their own guns from home and come and join the militia or the army. So they're saying here, in order to be ready for those young men to grab their guns and come fight and form a really quick army, people have to have the right to have guns. So I think that's really the meaning of that then. Today, we don't have that need, right? So it's a different situation today, and yet still we have the Second Amendment rights. Now, there's limits on the Second Amendment rights, right? You can have a gun, but you can't go and buy a tank or a fighter jet or a
Mhm.
nuclear missile, right?
Right. Right.
So there's
Mhm.
we pass a law, and then we kind of figure out what that law means, and we refine it and make it better.
Right.
Because the right to bear arms, yeah, you can't buy a nuclear missile, but you can buy a pistol or a rifle or a hunting gun. So things change over time. History changes. And so whenever you're reading something like this, any document or GED test or whatever, you got to think, when did this person write this? What was the world like when they wrote this? What were they thinking? For instance, the Third Amendment, nobody cares about today. It says, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered or put up to live in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. What was happening? So today, that nobody's ever talking about the Third Amendment. But during the Revolutionary War, if you lived in Boston or even your town in Pennsylvania, you might get a knock on your door at night, and it would be a soldier or a dozen soldiers, and they'd say, "We're going to sleep here tonight, and you're going to give us dinner, and we're going to sleep, and then you're going to give us breakfast." Like, they would demand it because they're the army, and so what are you going to do?
Mhm.
They passed. That must have been a big deal to them in 1787 because they passed this Third Amendment, making that illegal. Today, that doesn't matter. We don't need that Third Amendment anymore. But back then, it was important to them. Okay. Let's stop there for today. Next week, we'll pick up more with the Bill of Rights. We'll take another look. I have this old, I think it's a pretty old illustration here of the 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights. And again, some are more important to us today than others. And then from there, we'll go on. We'll look at other constitutional amendments. We'll look at the branches of government. We'll talk about government next week.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions on what we talked about? We talked about history. That took us a little while. And then the Declaration of Independence, Constitution. Any questions on those documents? Any questions at all?
No, you explained it clearly. It was good.
Good. Okay. Okay. Well, what I will do is I will send out an email this afternoon. I recorded this. I'll send out the recording. I'll send out this document that we're looking at And we didn't get super far in it, but I'll share that. If you want to read ahead, scope it out, check it out. We'll be looking at this for, I think, a couple of weeks.
Okay, I might come late again, okay, because I have gym class.
Okay. Yeah, Ruby, that's fine. You can always jump in there.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Well, have a great day, everybody. Thanks for logging in.
Okay. Thank
Okay, thank
you.
you.
All right. Take care.
Thank
too.
you.
Mhm.
Yeah. Bye. See you next week.
Yep.
See you next week.
Bye.